promise you, you'll always sound better than me. So
You sound fine.
No, it's just that Matt Qua's subject has some difficulty incorporating the mic into the ready to hand.
I see.
Yeah, for him it remains this alienated object, though we are holding out hope that it becomes part of his body schema and stays by his mouth. Handlichkeit, except with the mouth. What is that? Mundlichkeit.
Well, I'm actually in a closet, so I'm not able to move too much anyway.
All right, why don't I run the intro, which is not something that we run. Hello. Are we on? Okay, we're on. If you don't know what's going on here, this is the Pill Pod coming at you from Canada's downtown Toronto, your weekly critical theory and philosophy podcast. Today is Matt and I, but not only Matt and I. We're taking a break from your regularly scheduled phenomenology to discuss a YouTube channel, a book, and the voice behind them. That voice is, of course, that of the artist formerly known as Cuck Philosophy, now known as Jonas Cheka. How's the pronunciation on that? Am I
That's
close?
pretty good, yeah. It's Jonas Cheka.
Jonas, okay, here to talk about Marx and Nietzsche. So welcome here, Jonas.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Do you have any clarification on the state of the name Cuck, CCK? What do you go by? What's off limits?
I pretty much accept whatever name people call me. So usually these days people say either CCK or they just say Jonas Cheka. People are sort of getting used to just calling the name or calling the channel CCK Philosophy, which doesn't stand for anything. But
well, the struggle will be real because Cuck Philosophy has become a household name in some households. So we're definitely going to have to pivot here.
Yeah, it was kind of like a really drastic decision to change my channel name at that point. But I just felt like if I'm going to release a book and I'll have family members looking at it, I don't really want them to see Cuck.
Well, I should say your channel has actually been my go-to place for a lot of the books I purchased actually in the last 3 years, since your favorite books, 2018, 2019, and 2020, a healthy number of them made their way to my shelf, nice. Including Nancy Love's Marx, Nietzsche, and Modernity. I really appreciated that one suggestion.
Yeah, you've read it?
Yeah, it's excellent. I mean, actually, she's contributing to a collection on Nietzsche that I'm editing because I enjoyed the book so much. So,
yeah, I just kind of, I think I just found it on Amazon, and I hadn't heard of the book or her before, and yeah, it was extremely useful, while writing my own book because even though her ultimate conclusion is that they're incompatible, she just lays out so many similarities and overlaps between the two. So yeah, it was a pretty useful book.
Absolutely. So actually, I just had a couple of questions to kind of get us started. And I guess the number one question I had is, I started watching you back in 2018 when I was living in Mexico. And I'm not going to forget the moment. It's when I was on a treadmill and I was really bored because, that's the way it is. And I was like, gotta watch something entertaining. And I watched your video on Stephen Hicks, of all things, taking down his book, analyzing his account of postmodernity. And I thought, geez, this is really refreshing. We need more people to do that. So actually, you inspired me in part to start doing these kinds of takedowns of different conservative thinkers that I do, including Hicks. But can you tell me a little bit about what inspired you to start this channel? Was it just reading a lot of shitty conservative takes on left-wing or major philosophers, or was there some other motivation, some dark secret you're hiding from your audience?
Actually, the sort of idea of taking down conservative takes or whatever, that came pretty late. The original idea was to make more like the type of videos like the Marxist analysis of Shrek. What I was actually inspired at first is the idea of applying serious theory to really goofy pieces of pop culture. Remember in particular, somehow I had found this paper that was a Marxist analysis of the movie Mean Girls, and that seemed to me like something I want to do. So it was sort of just like originally almost like a joke, but also a joke that tries to be accurate on the theory. And then like at the time I was like starting to read a lot of the like French post-structuralists. And also that was the time when like Jordan Peterson was at his most popular. Mm-hmm. And, you know, just from my like beginner's like level of understanding, I could see just how much Peterson misrepresents these thinkers like Foucault and Derrida. And, you know, I just saw more and more of that online. And I don't know, I just felt like a strong urge to correct people. So I released a video like on Jordan Peterson and postmodernism. And that was actually the first video of mine that got like really popular.
I bet.
Well, I'm going to wager to guess that a large portion of our listener base knows who you are as one of the most popular YouTube channels that does philosophy in video essay form. And I mean, I guess that would shift depending on how broad your definition of philosophy is. But it was sometime around here when I started watching you that it was like Philosophy Tube, School of Life, and then lectures that constituted YouTube philosophy. And I think it's expanded since then quite a bit.
I've considered making like a video about the School of Life because I'm not a huge fan, as you can guess.
Yeah, Big Joel did one recently.
I started following you when you had like 20,000 subs, and I thought for the first time, oh shit, there's an internet audience for philosophy with its difficulty, including its questions. And of course, we're all in this game. You cannot present philosophy without grossly oversimplifying some aspect of it. That's just part of the medium if you want it to be useful. Because ultimately, the purpose is that you can engage someone with something difficult. But I think when I first watched your channel, if you wanted to watch any Baudrillard video on YouTube, there was like one 8-bit philosophy thing that was pretty terrible, or some lectures that are over an hour long, or your video, which is 10 minutes, here's the outline of the theorist, and 10 minutes, here's the application. So yours was the first time that I felt there was a balance between the difficulty and the application. You made me believe in internet philosophy, Jonas. I don't know if that's for the better or for the worse, but you bear some of the responsibility for us all sitting here.
It's something to be proud about. But yeah, it just kind of shows just how much people are actually interested in philosophy, because like there's been so many like people like new atheists or like pop scientists claiming that, you know, philosophy is useless or dead or that it doesn't matter anymore. But it's obvious that people, you know, still want philosophy, or at least a substitute. And
Jonas,
they'll like, yeah.
Didn't you hear Richard Dawkins? You know, the reason he says philosophy is dead is because he loves truth so much. You know, he truths so hard that he just can't help but say these things, right?
Yeah. I loved. Have you seen that Richard Dawkins tweet where he was like, "How can there be such a thing as continental philosophy? How can philosophy be particular to a particular continent?"
Yeah, asking the deep questions. That's we got to get to the bottom of this one, guys.
Yeah, this was also a guy who was like, Kafka, how do people turn into bugs? Don't like it. Really weird. 0 stars for the metamorphosis, right?
I'm sorry to say it's absolute rubbish. It's impossible. Anyway, Jonas, I'm interested to know, now that you've written a book, so you're now a multimedia artist.
Mm-hmm.
What is the strength of the video essay medium, and what, with your YouTube channel humming along, what makes you decide one day, you know, I cannot do another video essay until this book gets written? How did that become the next project for you?
And just as an addendum, I was actually worried that your channel had gone, you know, into the ether, because I was like, man, it's been a long time since he's actually published anything. I wonder if he's just moved on with his life. And then all of a sudden you were everywhere, you know, talking about the book, releasing videos, doing the Q&A. I was like, oh, so he was just writing this 260-page opus for our benefit. So it sounds like it was time well spent.
Yeah. Well, like, it definitely wasn't like pre-planned. It was actually just I had some like thoughts about writing a book before, but what really started it was that someone who like personally knew the publisher just emailed me and said, if you're interested in writing a book, I could get you in touch with Repeater Books.
Cool.
And I said, I'll think about it, maybe. And they got me in touch, and actually a year passed before I suddenly had the idea of like writing a book on Nietzsche. And yeah, so it was actually like the offer came to me first, and then I just like spent a lot of time wondering what I could possibly write about. And Nietzsche seemed like a natural like choice. First of all, because he's like a very controversial thinker, and everyone knows him, but everyone has different ideas about him. And also, like, he has influenced a lot of the post-structuralist stuff that I've talked about in my YouTube channel. So it seemed like a natural choice. And my initial idea was to write just a kind of left-wing perspective reading of Nietzsche. And I was going to just talk about like leftists and socialists who've been inspired by Nietzsche and have written about him. And then as I've researched, I ended up like finding more and more interesting points of similarity, specifically with Marx. So while I was working on the book, Marx sort of became like the second half of the book. Yeah, and again, Marx is also like someone everyone knows, but is very, very often misrepresented. So it just seemed like a good topic to write a book about.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm super jealous of this title. I'll get into like what the book's about because I have some questions about it. But How to Philosophize with a Hammer and Sickle, Nietzsche, Marx for the 21st Century. I saw that and I was like, God damn. It's like kind of the Beach Boys looking up at the Beatles and thinking like, fuck, I'm never going to come up with a title as good as that.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that, because actually like towards the end of writing the book, I was considering changing the title. But my publisher encouraged me not to, so I'm glad I made the right decision.
I don't think, no matter how many possible worlds you have, that there's a better name than this.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy with it. Yeah.
So as one more initial question, we've had a lot of books on both Nietzsche and Marx. So what was it that made you think we need one more book on these guys? And the thrust of the question is really, who's the audience? Who should pick this thing up?
My main goal was kind of similar to what I try to do with my videos, which is to keep it like accessible to non-experts while trying not to dumb it down.
Right.
Yeah.
So like I wasn't like writing like necessarily with other academics in mind. I thought a lot about like the lay people who will probably read it, and so I've tried to keep it accessible, and so that naturally led to like criticizing some very popular misrepresentations of Marx in particular, but Nietzsche also. And at the same time, I've tried to like keep it interesting enough that people who already are familiar with Marx and Nietzsche would, still find it interesting to read, because maybe my interpretation isn't like the most standard one. So I've kind of just tried to write for everyone. I guess it's kind of like Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a book for everyone and no one.
Yeah, or a book for free spirits is kind of what I was thinking of when I was reading this, right? Because it's definitely a book that challenges a lot of our conceptions. Well, just before we dive into the kind of substance of this and some of your other work, I noticed in the book, you have a long section about academic philosophy. including some pretty funny pot shots at analytic philosophers in particular. But you describe academic philosophy as kind of a necessary enterprise, and it produces useful things in some cases. People like William Van Orman Quine appears at various points in the book. But you say, the problem with academic philosophy is oftentimes it's very dry, extremely narrowly focused, and it doesn't like to think about these kind of big pictures. I'm just putting it really simply, issues. And develop, as you call it sometimes, total critiques of society, including things like capital and its global impact. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, what's wrong, in your opinion, with academic philosophy? The kind of program that sits there and says, if you want a career in this discipline, your job is to go read Schelling and then write an essay or a thesis on one of his books and try to carve out your narrow niche in the scholarship there.
Yeah, so like, if you look at precisely Marx and Nietzsche, they were both themselves, very critical of academia, and they weren't really academic thinkers. Nietzsche left university at an early age. Marx wrote a PhD, but then, most of his career was not in academia. And it was because they didn't write just for other academics that they were able to reach such an influence.
Right.
And I think one of the problems is that, if you want to have a good academic career, you have to write for other academics, basically. And that's one problem. And another problem, which is kind of, I guess a problem of knowledge today in general, is that it encourages increasing specialization to the point where, every particular person is focusing on such a small, part of a particular subtopic that, as you mentioned, it's kind of difficult to see the big picture. And it's kind of this like general problem of knowledge we have, where, Baudrillard said that we have more and more information, but less and less meaning. And everyone has to be such a specialist that it can be hard to see how all of these different specialties relate to each other and form something coherent. I guess those would be like my main criticisms. And obviously it's not to say that academia is useless or that it produces nothing worthwhile. But I think it's a problem that, especially in the past few decades, academia is especially academic philosophy has been kind of like a self-enclosed bubble where not much comes out to influence, the general culture. And I think that's something that should be, struggled against.
Yeah, I remember when I was in grad school, I was told, if you publish a paper in a pretty good journal that 100 people read and 2 comment on it, you're doing a pretty good job. This was when I was 23, 24, whenever I was starting my PhD, forever ago, it seems. And a part of me was like, boy, that's a pretty big pressure. It's got to be a good article. But I also thought, man, that's a pretty narrow aspiration in life. So 2 people will give enough of a shit about what I work on to comment on it. And that's going to be a milestone,
Yeah, right. And compared compared with someone like Hegel, who was like a celebrity, like people would literally pay for tickets to see lectures by Hegel, and things have changed so much. And I think it's a shame that there's this sentiment in the general culture that philosophy isn't significant anymore. And I think to fight that, we have to kind of try to break out of the academic bubble and also to try to make our philosophy be significant for non-academic matters, right? Because that's what Marx and Nietzsche tried to do. They learned from academia, and then they tried to apply it, outside of academia to the most significant parts of human life. So
you're a pretty popular figure in the internet kind of discourse of philosophy. Do you invest much time in it? Are you happy with where it's at? Do you think it can be improved? What can be improved? I'm interested in your scope of the landscape.
just regarding like internet philosophy generally.
Yeah. Us on Twitter.
Well, Twitter is kind of a problem,
No.
Like,
No. Sorry. Okay. Twitter was totally a joke. Not Twitter per se. I just mean the fact that I think, anyway, this conversation would have not taken place 4 years ago. There are YouTubers doing some kind of primary source philosophy. There are podcasts, not just ours, but like Asset Horizon, doing actual readings. Twitter itself is a joke.
Phils, you're wrong. Twitter is where the greatest minds of our generation meet to exchange the deepest thoughts in the most profound media.
I mean, besides that, though.
Yeah, lay out.
yeah. Well, I don't know. It's kind of hard to get an overview. I mean, like, I'm glad that there's been such a proliferation of internet philosophy. I think that's something that should be welcomed. Obviously, sometimes the medium itself can be a problem, and especially on Twitter. I think one problem with internet philosophy is that it often encourages like very, I don't know, like division into groups where every single question has to be understood as like a conflict between two internet subcultures. But I don't know if that's just like a part of the internet as a medium.
No, I think that's very true. I mean, I've written for a number of different magazines, and I published one article that was like reasonably well received about like the IDW, criticizing them. And I just got like loads of requests, including from the same publisher, being like, more stuff on the IDW, more stuff on the IDW. And my response is like, well, first off, they've already said kind of what I wanted to about this. And second off, like, there's really not much to say. I mean, their criticisms and comments are pretty brittle. You point that out, and that's more or less what you can do if you don't want to like diagnose them culturally.
Yeah.
But there really was this kind of pressure, more of the same, more us versus them kind of mentality. Have you experienced something similar?
Well, people do kind of expect you to, kind of like stay within a certain narrow circle of what you're exploring. So, for example, I used to do videos mostly on postmodernism. Right. And then when I sort of became more explicitly Marxist, there were a lot of really angry people, like, like, oh, I subbed to your channel because you were giving these, good explanations of postmodernism, and now you're doing this like political radicalism, and I want no part of it. There is that.
Kind of funny.
Yeah, but at the same time, there is a kind of freedom to it that you wouldn't get in academia, because it's in the end, it is me who decides what I'm going to do a video about. And the people who sort of, the people who support me on Patreon, at least, are pretty happy to endorse, whatever I want to talk about, so long as it's interesting enough.
Yeah, the crowd-funded model makes so much more content possible than would be otherwise, for sure.
Absolutely. So there's this quote in your book, just to push back on that a little bit, where you say, we'll make Willard the enemy for today. The American philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine, who is nevertheless an undoubtedly worthwhile philosopher, and I agree, and everyone should read Two Dogmas of Empiricism, encapsulated the academic will to truth when he said, and this is a quote from him, "The student who majors in philosophy primarily for spiritual comfort is misguided and probably not a very good student anyway, since intellectual curiosity is not what moves him." And you respond by saying, behind Quine's denigration of, quote, spiritual comfort, which, despite its peculiar wording, is a reasonable thing to look for in philosophy, hides the fact that what Quine calls the good student also finds a form of comfort, as spiritual comfort, in academic philosophy. The comfort of satisfying the will to truth, writing from the perspective of no one, erasing oneself from the text, of becoming a non-individual in one's research, right? And I think that's a great critique of Quine. But isn't there a danger in looking to, let's just call it internet philosophy, for a kind of spiritual comfort? Precisely because the kind of intellectual standards Quine is putting forward can get watered down a little bit. We were taking shots at School of Life, and I agree with that early on. But I mean, one of the things that they put themselves forward as is as a kind of medium for comforts, ideas in their most digestible form. And I see a lot of that on the internet. So is this a danger, you think?
Yeah, well, it kind of depends on what kind of comfort we're talking about. Because I do think that philosophy should be related to, human affects and the sort of, let's say, spiritual needs of human beings.
Right.
And the thing about the School of Life is it's not particularly good at even delivering that. Like, with the School of Life, I don't think the problem is that they're too focused on like just giving you something comfortable and that's it. I don't think they're even able to deliver that because the kind of content they provide is something that you've heard 100 times before. And, it might give someone like a philosopher's name to throw out to sound clever, but I don't think it's actually like, a means by which to like struggle with your emotions or struggle spiritually. And the people who do provide a certain kind of spiritual comfort, like maybe Nietzsche, are thinkers that you have to kind of struggle through. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I think that's so on point because, I got this beef with philosophers, quote unquote, who say, here's why you just should be fine, compared to those who say, you don't feel fine, and here's part of the reason why, or why not.
I was just going to say, this is the problem I have with the channel is that, and other things like it gives you kind of the safest, most bourgeois, most coffee table interpretation of what are sometimes really dangerous, radical, provocative thinkers, and says, here's consolation. When really what was interesting about people like Kierkegaard or Marx or Nietzsche is precisely that they demanded you pay more attention to the problems in your life. You don't try to opiate them away, but rather say, Jesus, life is full of suffering and shit. I really have to think carefully about how I'm going to respond to that. Putting it simple.
Like my main problem with Quine was this idea that in philosophy you have to basically become a non-individual, where your personal concerns, don't matter, and you have to kind of become this pure, affectless subject. And I think that, as I said in the book, that, even the most analytic philosophers are still driven by something personal, are still driven by some kind of affect in their philosophical endeavors. And I think that, pointing that out is important.
Isn't Alain de Botton's book called The Consolation of Philosophy?
Is it? I'm not sure.
He's all about consoling, the soul needs help.
He does have a very soothing voice, though. You know what I mean?
Lacan
friend of mine
made the point first that we will always be misunderstood.
Fuck it.
A friend of mine actually read that book, and gave a kind of overview of it for me. But one thing in particular he mentioned was, just the very idea of, reducing Nietzsche to like a figure of consolation is kind of a problem because, maybe it ends in consolation, but at least at first Nietzsche should sort of make you uncomfortable a little bit. I'd have to like look back at the notes that he wrote for me, but it kind of goes back to that general thing that School of Life does, where it takes these, like big thinkers and reduces them to these like platitudes,
right?
Like everything has a purpose, or I don't know.
We want the popularization of philosophy in one sense, but not necessarily pop philosophy in this sense.
Yeah.
So speaking of the Nietzsches, because there are multiple Nietzsches, and you've made your case for one, but of course we can't forget there's the sexist Nietzsche, the proto-fascist Nietzsche, and lately we've seen this in current, not just of School and Life, but also our daddy, our Toronto daddy, Jordan B. Peterson. He's got this self-help Nietzsche that's tailored for the young males with the Star Wars moral architecture. So I was wondering, what does your Nietzsche correct in this amalgam? Because it's going to be contentious, of course. Nietzsche's not a socialist.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you say that
You wouldn't read on its face immediately that he's a socialist.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I don't think he's a socialist. Just to make
So
it
what are you trying to mix in here to, I guess, fix or defend or challenge those other interpretations?
That's a big question. So,
If you want a simpler version of the question, we could go back to when you said you should struggle through something. What is the thing you think we should struggle through there with socialist Nietzsche?
So there's kind of, two aspects to it, which first of all concerns not trivializing Marx and then not trivializing Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
So, and what shouldn't be trivialized about both of them is the fact that they wanted a fundamentally transformed world, a fundamentally different form of human life. And what's happened with both of them is Marx has been kind of used not as that kind of figure, but as someone who just wants to kind of fix certain, surface problems in our current world, or wants to make certain reforms. And then Nietzsche has also been trivialized in that sense, where his desire to transform the world is say reduced to just like
clean your room,
an academic literary practice or something like that. And also I don't claim to simply represent directly what Nietzsche believed, because obviously he wasn't a socialist. It was more so taking this Nietzschean drive to transform the world, and looking at how that might be used by a socialist, and how that might be applied to our current world, the world of global capital, and how we could use, Nietzsche's existential goals and realize them in Marx's material goals. And and also like Nietzsche kind of has this idea that the sense of a given entity is not given in itself, but is only produced by another entity sort of taking possession of it. And that's obviously very true with readings of Nietzsche themselves. And I think every reading of Nietzsche is kind of like an example of one will to power taking over another one, that is Nietzsche's works, and kind of producing something new from it. And this book is itself a case of that. And because of that, I think in chapter 3, I talk about, both the ways that Nazis have used Nietzsche, but then also the ways that communists and socialists have used Nietzsche to sort of, illustrate that point. And one of my interests is precisely, the form that Nietzsche took when being utilized by radical thinkers.
I should say, yeah, I think you're very successful at that. And I think one of the problems I have whenever I read secondary literature on Nietzsche or Marx, since I'm editing this collection on Nietzsche, I've read a lot of that now, is that their personality kind of gets swallowed up by the gigantic personality of the Antichrist, right? And what's really nice about your book is that your personality still shines through. If you want to put it in kind of Nietzschean terms, there is a sense where one will to power is confronting another will, and it creates something productive and interesting from this dynamic, but you don't get subsumed by the kind of literature that you're working on, which is quite an accomplishment. I had a quick question though. So correct me if I'm wrong, because this was my interpretation of your book, as much of it as I've read so far, because I still, again, have 80 pages left. And again, if you claim that you're an objectivist and, tell everyone to clean their room at the end, and that was the secret lesson of this whole text, forgive me. Okay. But, I was a bit surprised when reading it, because I thought that this was mostly going to be a book on Marx, interpreting Nietzsche through a Marxist lens. But what I notice is that Nietzsche is really the primary character in the text, the primary figure that you deal with. But what's interesting about it is, of course, since you argue for a kind of Nietzschean socialism that is violence, right? In the sense of doing violence to Nietzsche's text, it's almost like you're trying to push Nietzsche towards Marx. So there is a kind of dynamic tension between the two, where Marx is almost the primary figure, just kind of out there, and Nietzsche has to kind of be pushed towards him. Would you say that that's an interesting or correct characterization of the book, or would you look at it a different way?
I think that's fair, because, again, one of the points I make early on in the book is that any interpretation of a significant thinker has to be in some sense selective. And whether you're reading Nietzsche as like a postmodernist or a reactionary or, a radical, you'll always be selective towards certain parts of Nietzsche. I mean, there's just no other option. You have to be selective. And Nietzsche himself, in Ecce Homo, in his last published book, he looked back at his own works and was selective towards them himself.
Nietzsche's selection process is in Ecce Homo, why I write such good books and why I am so wise.
You have to be selective, but also, proud and confident. But yeah, because to put it in kind of different terms, I tried to write this book not as a representation, but as an event. Right. Because, if you're trying to just purely represent, without any impurities, what a particular philosopher thought, the best you can come up with is just the perfect, copy of their own works. So like any interesting interpretation must be selective in some sense and also push a thinker into some direction.
I hear that, man.
And what I wanted to make sure to do is to make that explicit and conscious so that people don't feel like I'm kind of tricking them into accepting a certain version of Nietzsche, but I made clear from the beginning that, like all philosophy, this is a selective work. It is driven by personal goals and affects I have, and it is a kind of personal endeavor, even though, I tried also as much as I can to let Marx and Nietzsche speak for themselves within that kind of selection.
Absolutely. So this is kind of the heart of the book. So we can take it in a few stages if you want. But for those of us, and I include myself in that category, who might be skeptical that Nietzsche has much in the way to offer socialists, what does he have to offer socialists? Like, why do we need Nietzsche, or at least this very creative, radical interpretation of Nietzsche that you're giving in the book?
Yeah, I wanted to just add, our longtime listeners, right, might remember a particular guest who went so far as to suggest that we shouldn't even read Nietzsche because the proto-fascist seed is in there. And if you read it, it's going to get into your heart and, wrap its roots around it, and you're going to become a fascist. I'm only overstating a little bit, which is the sad part.
Yeah, that was a spicy episode. I'll never forget that. Just like, you're wrong.
Who was it?
Ronald Biener. Ronnie, he's actually a good friend of mine. We meet for coffee every now and then, and he's contributing to the collection. But yeah, he does not like Nietzsche at all. And he wrote a very good book.
We didn't all see eye to eye on this interpretation.
Yeah. If you want, you might actually be interested. His book is Dangerous Minds, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and the Return of the Far Right. And actually,
I've heard the name, yeah.
He has a similar kind of background to you, where he says, fascinated by Nietzsche early on, really kind of electrified by his thinking, but then kind of turned against him later on when he saw how he was influencing some of these other people. But
that reminds me a bit of an academic by the name of Jeff Waite, who wrote a book called Nietzsche's Corpse. I don't know if you've heard of it.
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
Yeah, it kind of has this similar idea where Nietzsche for him is almost like this infectious force that turns people who otherwise might be communists into like secret reactionaries.
Well, we do have to get these reactionaries under control, like Bataille, Deleuze, Derrida.
Yeah.
You know, they're just they're going out. They're saying whatever they want out there, you know?
But one thing that I have noticed while writing this book is that as Marxism has been, in my view, in various ways distorted and weakened and trivialized, it is often precisely those parts of him that link him to Nietzsche that have been kind of removed from Marxism. So I'm thinking, for example, of the critique of morality,
Right.
To an extent, the critique of nationalism. Nietzsche even critiques things like wage labor and the state in his own particular way. And I don't think that's, I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that there's a kind of radical spirit to Nietzsche that again comes from his desire to, negate the modern world for the sake of something new that he shares with Marx. And I think that's something that should be upheld in Marx. So I talk about stuff like that. And then also when it comes to Nietzsche's critiques of socialism, what I notice is that, funnily enough, a lot of the critiques Nietzsche makes about socialism, Marx made himself.
Yeah.
So, for example,
I should say, I think that's the most convincing part of the book, where I learned the most, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, for example, in the 1844 manuscripts, Marx criticized what he calls crude communism. And the things he says about it is, for example, that it is actually disguised envy and greed, that it reduces, minimizes the world of art and culture, that it is a kind of leveling down, right? All of the things precisely that Nietzsche criticized in socialism. And we can also talk about, the socialist figures that Nietzsche was familiar with, but the foremost representative of socialism for Nietzsche was Eugen Düring, who was an anti-Marxist and also an anti-Semite, and Marx and Engels themselves, hated him and kind of poked fun at him for still believing that he has discovered a universal and absolute moral system, and Engels literally wrote a book called Anti-Düring, almost like, Antichrist. And excerpts of that book were then published as Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, and became one of the most, significant popular texts of classical Marxism. So, yeah, that's a pretty significant thing, that Nietzsche's criticisms of socialism are, worth listening to and should be taken seriously, because in many ways they overlap with Marx's own, and kind of they might teach us how to prevent our own understandings of socialism from becoming something trivial or weak.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say, again, I think that that's the most, for me, interesting part of the book. And I will say to those of our listeners who know my opinions on this, you did make me budge on that, right? I did think to myself, okay, this is a valid point and I do need to consider it. And I'll get back to you with what my final thoughts are. But let's come at it from a different direction. So we've talked a little bit about what Nietzsche gives to Marx, in your opinion, right? So what then does Marx offer Nietzsche? And I'm thinking here that there are any number of Marxist figures. I think probably Frederick Jameson has engaged with him in the most deep and interesting way in The Political Unconscious, who say, Nietzsche has some insights, but he lacks a lot of good stuff. Let's just put it that way, right? In particular, of course, from a Marxist perspective, he lacks a sustained critique of the capitalist political economy. You can find gestures of criticism towards, bourgeois moralism. And as you point out routinely in the book, there are comments about the kind of decadent quality to affluence concentrating in the capitalist class, but there's nothing comparable to capital. So what would Marx then have to teach Nietzsche if, they were taking turns, educating one another?
Yeah, so one of Nietzsche's biggest strengths is also his biggest weakness, which is that he was in a certain way disconnected from his society, right? Because, at an early age, he left university. He was a very solitary figure. He lived the rest of his life off his, university pension. And one thing that allowed him to do is perform a kind of total critique of this society, which he was looking at almost as if, from afar, because he didn't have to be an academic. He didn't have to be a worker. He didn't have to be, a businessman. And that kind of allowed him to be equally critical of all of those aspects of our society. And that was one of his strengths, but at the same time, because he lacked grounding in the particular social formations of modernity, he wasn't particularly good at providing kind of the materialist point of view, the materialist ideas about what would, transform this world. And as I mentioned in the book, early on, when he still, hadn't isolated himself, he made various critiques of bourgeois society, including its economy, including wage labor, and then he began talking about this stuff less and less the more isolated he became, and that was kind of a missing piece from his philosophy. And obviously that's something Marx provides. In Daybreak, Nietzsche actually talks about how dehumanizing wage labor is, and he suggests as a solution that all these wage workers should simply engage in mass emigration, and that would somehow solve their condition. I think that shows that Nietzsche saw the problems with the forms of production and just social formations in general of bourgeois society, but at the same time, because he kind of lacked grounding in it, he lacked material ideas about how to change it. So that's the part I think that Marx brings to the table.
If we are going to take a cue from social forms of morality or tables of values, then Christianity, liberalism, and socialism are all moral systems that really just allow losers to get ahead for Nietzsche. And Nietzsche doesn't really take any pains to separate them one from another. So if we commit to your reading, then how do we reconcile the individual with the collective?
So there's several aspects to that. And one part of Nietzsche's critique is asceticism. And, he often critiqued socialism as being ascetic. And that actually made a lot of sense because there were a lot of socialist groups at the time who were kind of, influenced by religious thought and believed that socialism involves like being more ascetic, denying your needs, denying your individuality for the sake of the collective good. And Marx's vision was completely anti-ascetic. Marx has this idea that the proliferation of your own desires is actually a good thing, that we should proliferate our desires and needs because that is what makes us richer as people. And he, in a lot of places made clear that the kind of society that he wants is not one where individuals deny themselves for the sake of the collective good, but where individuals realize themselves precisely through collective forms of life. And sort of, there's an individualist aspect to Marx where, everything that somehow that blocks my development as an individual should be destroyed. So, Marx isn't so much a collectivist, in the sense of being opposed to individualism. He's someone who wants to transcend the very, strict distinction between individual and collective. And there's even, parts in Nietzsche where that almost seems to be happening. For example, the first time Nietzsche ever uses the term will to power, he actually isn't talking about an individual will to power, but he is talking about the will to power of different peoples. So there is that strain in Nietzsche. And then another, part of Marx that is kind of Nietzschean is this idea of empowerment. That, the proletariat isn't like good because it is meek. It's not, the proletariat shouldn't strive to be sort of the weak person who is therefore morally good, but the proletariat is precisely both dehumanized, but in a certain sense empowered in bourgeois society, and that empowerment should be, pushed to its extreme. And then there is also, for example, one interesting thing I noticed was Nietzsche uses a French word to describe certain elements of the herd, which is canaille, I think it is. And Marx, in a letter, uses that precise word and said the proletariat must not be, canaille, but must, be strong and autonomous and powerful, basically. And so there's that emphasis on empowerment. There's the emphasis on anti-asceticism, the proliferation of needs. There's probably more. Maybe I'll remember that.
That's a great answer. I can tell you've written a book on this.
Yeah,
oh, thank you.
It's very
Thank
comprehensive. And I should say, I think you're absolutely right that people often misunderstand Marxism as advocating for a kind of deflationary socialism where we all move back to basically the world of Avatar, from the James Cameron movie.
Exactly,
we all hold hands and we sit in front of a tree and we decide to give up, technology for the sake of a kind of more primitive, or at least more naturalistic existence. And he was very opposed to that as a kind of good modern thinker.
And as with Nietzsche as well, this is a completely imbecilic response that Nietzsche wanted to return to the old world order. Nietzsche wants to go back and rewind the clock and live in ancient Sparta. No. Though, I've never even thought that Nietzsche was responding to particular groups of socialists that he was watching. That never even occurred to me before, so that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'll lend you the book when I'm done. I should be finished by tomorrow, Phil, so when I see you. Go ahead.
For example, one important, interesting thing to point out is that the socialists that Nietzsche was most familiar with were all anti-Semites. So, for example, obviously he was familiar with Wagner, who early on was a kind of revolutionary. He was anti-Semitic. Wagner was arguably influenced by Proudhon, who was also anti-Semitic. And then, as I mentioned, the foremost representative of socialism for Nietzsche was Dühring, who was also anti-Semitic. Nietzsche famously said a lot of, he hated anti-Semites. So it's almost likely that in his mind, socialism and anti-Semitism was to some extent, equated.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a very interesting part of the book, particularly the discussions about Dühring and Nietzsche's parallel criticisms of Dühring's socialism, along with Engels, which is also a good book, I should say. But I had a kind of different criticism or comment. The one thing I thought that your book maybe could have done a bit more of, and I say this with love because I kind of wanted this, is you indicate that you're not really going to be dealing with the religious dimensions of modernization, secularization, the criticism of Christianity. There are references to it in the book, but it's not foregrounded. And I'm wondering why you chose to do that, because for somebody like me, modernity has to be understood in terms of liberalization, the spread of capitalism, and also secularization. And also because Nietzsche tied a lot of his criticisms of egalitarian movements to a critique of Christianity, both its metaphysics and its morality. He had this kind of famous statement where he said, socialism is the residue of Christianity and Rousseau in a de-Christianized world, which is a fascinating, kind of explanation. And I've kind of used this to myself to criticize people like Jordan Peterson to say, look, if you're really looking for contemporary Christians, a lot of them might look a lot like the woke people out there advocating for more equality, more inclusion, more leveling of domineering social hierarchies. So this kind of take is wrong, right? So how would you respond to something like that? And what do you think how do you think we could extend your book to an analysis of religion?
So the reason I didn't write a lot about religion, because obviously both Nietzsche and Marx criticized religion and Christianity in particular. Part of it was just because in our culture in the past 1 or 2 decades, critiques of religion have been, done by these self-congratulatory new atheists, whose critiques of religion are like, only skin deep and don't actually touch, the fundamentals of our society. And I didn't want to give into that kind of self-congratulatory new atheism, but
I completely can empathize with that. By the way, I think that's say no more. I think that's a good explanation.
But also because actually focusing on religion is important, but it can also be misleading in that it can sometimes lead people to miss, the kind of the essence of the critique. So for example, Nietzsche, of course, criticized Christianity, but at the same time, he said that certain secular thinkers in our age are not Christian, or at least, not explicitly Christian, but they end up reproducing the negative forms of Christianity, right? That they end up reproducing the slave morality of Christianity or the will to truth. And that, it's that point that can be missed if you focus too much on religion, because, religion is kind of a social phenomenon, and being a social phenomenon, it can be in various forms reproduced in secular form. So I wanted to, there's a short section in the book where I kind of talk about why I mention why I don't talk that much about religion in the book. And that is because I don't want people to kind of focus on the wrong thing, because I think that in Nietzsche's view, Christianity, at least in its explicit form, could be eradicated, and yet its negative social effects could still persist in society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you very rightly point out that what's innovative about his commentary is he doesn't just launch what we could call logical or epistemological critiques of Christian metaphysics, because he's aware of the fact that most people don't believe in God because they sat down and, read St. Anselm's ontological proof of God's existence, right? It serves a social function, so you need to get at that and understand it historically, which I think is really important to stress, right?
And speaking of historically, I'm gonna throw you just the broadest question, and you're gonna have to figure out how to whittle it down. I know you have your fourth chapters on historical philosophy and philosophical history, and we've just been name dropping, as we're prone to do, Schopenhauer, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, postmodernism, and I was wondering how specifically I would call their forms of history different, but they're both against a certain other kind of historicism. If you have Nietzsche, who's kind of an ecstatic existentialist historicist, versus Marx, who's a materialist historicist, how do you compare their views of history and maybe fit it into the rest of the stuff that we've been yammering on about?
Could you ask a bigger question?
Well, that's why I said he's gonna have to whittle it down. I'm interested in the history question.
One thing I think that's particularly worth mentioning is that Marx is often interpreted and often is, a lot of Marxists read Marx as a teleological thinker, and also a determinist thinker, where through there's a particular progression to history that you have to pass through, and that it inevitably leads towards a certain goal. And Nietzsche is well known as a critic of teleological history. Nietzsche emphasizes the contingent, ruptures, the arbitrary aspects of history. But Marx also actually criticizes teleology. There's one, I think in the German ideology, he says that this idea that history moves towards a telos is only a kind of idea that is only produced after the fact and kind of artificially applied to past history. It's not something that exists as an inherent part of history itself. And Marx emphasized that it is particular individuals and the social formations that they create that moves history forward. It's not anything like spirit, and there's no kind of de-individualized form of historical progression. And he even he congratulated Darwin for I think he said that Darwin destroyed teleology in the biological sciences, and he praised him for that.
No, absolutely. And Marx is well known for his Nietzsche is well known for his genealogical analysis of history, and Marx is well known for his dialectical or historically dialectical account of history. I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but can you tell us a little bit about what differentiates these two ways of analyzing history philosophically and what brings them together, since you spent a lot of time kind of mincing this difficult theoretical question in your book? And I think it is important for us to understand some of these theoretical subtleties.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm wondering if you can also differentiate for us the particular misconception of history as a series of particular events towards a given end, compared to what I see as their common trait, which is between the two having history as the appearance and disappearance of values.
So one thing that brings them together, actually, I could tie this back to what you mentioned about Marxism not being a kind of return to nature, a return to primitive communism. I think there's a kind of similar structure to Nietzsche and Marx, where just as it's important to emphasize that Marx doesn't want to return to primitive communism, Nietzsche doesn't actually want to return to master morality. Because, this is a common misconception that, he wants to return to master morality, where in fact, master morality, even though it was affirmative, it was still kind of like dumb in a sense. It was almost like an animal kind of existence. And
you think of Achilles just stomping around, near Troy, being like, I'm the biggest and the baddest, and I'm going to kill you all, right?
It's like, Hector, get your ass out here.
Exactly. that, it's like slave morality, as much as Nietzsche critiques it, it actually sort of deepens human life, makes it more interesting. It makes individuals more interesting. And he says that great human beings actually have a mix of slave morality and master morality. So the kind of historical, the part of their historical philosophy that I'm pointing to here is a dialectical term that they both used, which is Selbstaufhebung, which is kind of like self-sublation. And Nietzsche is often read as an anti-dialectical thinker, but there is at least this dialectical aspect to the way he views history, and that is that that certain historical formations end in a kind of negation of the negation, where slave morality negates master morality, but then that negation, the negation of slave morality in turn, isn't a mere reversal, but a kind of sublation of the two. So what Nietzsche, I think, is pointing to in the Übermensch is a kind of mix that takes both the positive from master morality and the positive from slave morality. Just as for Marx, in a certain sense, communism returns to primitive communism in the sense of common property, but it is like a completely, advanced stage, because it contains within itself the entire history of bourgeois society and utilizes the forces of production that bourgeois society has produced. So there's that that's the broad historical similarity that these two thinkers have. I think it's important to emphasize that the end goal is not just a simple reversal. And that's a simplification that I think has done a lot of harm.
That's so true. And it's done the harm to both of them.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of dumb oversimplification that is not... You don't just find this in internet philosophy, but you also find this in accepted academic readings of Nietzsche.
Exactly.
Specifically in political philosophy. Like, look, if you think that you've suddenly discovered an interpretation that ends with you being really smart and with Nietzsche and Marx being totally ignorant of the ongoing dialectic of values, and not even dialectic, but the accident of values from history, then sorry, the problem is probably with your interpretation. But you're doing the good sort of violence, in my opinion. You're doing the good sort of violence to the text, which is to say, I don't care what you thought you meant. Here's the correct hermeneutic. And this is the kind of reading that I find respectable.
Yeah, and I should say, my favorite video of yours is actually a fairly recent one of yours. I did enjoy the Doom one, by the way, because killing Margaret Thatcher as a demon does sound fun. But it's actually about Kentaro Miero's Berserk, which is a favorite anime of mine. And he wrote characters really successfully that seem to embody this Nietzschean ethos in the sense of being kind of Achilles-like, strong and powerful and life-affirming. But they did have the kind of soul of a Christ-like figure in the sense that they were reflective, deep, asked themselves whether they were doing the right thing. They weren't just warlike kind of dummies, to use your terminology.
And shout out to our Bible people out there. But Nietzsche thought it was an affront to put the New Testament of the Bible next to the Old Testament of the Bible, because the New Testament is a bunch of pussies, whereas the Old Testament is King David, who is on one hand the warrior and then on the other hand the poet.
Yeah, because if you look just at first glance, if you look at Guts, the main character,
it's kind of he's like Achilles on steroids, right? He's got the fucking massive manga sword that heaves through knights like they're nothing. Yeah,
at first it might seem like the most stereotypical action hero possible, this huge muscular guy with a huge sword, and he slays demons and enjoys it, and he loves being covered in blood.
And I do enjoy it. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah,
it's pretty cool.
Yeah, of course. But then what really makes his character special is when you go deeper into the story and you find underneath it all that he has like trauma and psychological needs and ambitions. And yeah, so it's that kind of precisely, I never actually thought of it this way, but he's kind of like a combination of master and slave morality, where he's kind of like affirmative but without being, dumbed down to a kind of like muscle-bound freak,
And so is Griffith, for that matter, even though I hate him.
Yeah.
Which reminds me, any of our listeners, if you like Berserk, 1990s TV show is all on YouTube now. So DM me if you're interested.
Nice.
Always talk about it. But I had, okay, just to kind of move in the direction of wrapping up, one of the key sections of your book is appropriately called a Nietzschean socialism, which I imagine, I think at least, is what's going to give you the most flack. Can you give us a quick introduction to what a Nietzschean socialism would look like? So we've done we've analyzed some of their criticisms, their methods, their historical analyses. What's the cash payoff, to use a vulgar term, from this in terms of Nietzschean socialism?
Yeah, and have you gotten any shit for it yet, or is that still to come?
Good question. Good follow-up.
Actually, not that much. I mean, I saw on Goodreads there were 2 people who gave me 1 star. That probably have something to do with that. And there's been like, a couple people who have kind of, scoffed at this idea that you're going to use Nietzsche for socialism, but no extended critique, which obviously I welcome. I'd be interested to hear more extended critiques.
We'll get Jordan Peterson on the line.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, hopefully he'll read my book. But so, there's parts of Nietzschean socialism I've already touched on, which is that it's a form of empowerment and the proliferation of needs, the proliferation of art and culture, rather than, denying yourself for the sake of the collective good. It's also, as we've mentioned, a self-sublation rather than a mere reversal, that it's not just primitive communism. And also another way to look at this is that in bourgeois society you have this struggle between the worker and the capitalist, and often the way that Marxism is understood is as a reversal of those 2 terms, where the worker becomes the absolute side of society rather than the capitalist, when again it's actually a sublation, where for Marx the worker as such doesn't really exist. In socialism you just have human beings who produce, but they're not wage laborers. They're not there to feed the mechanisms of capital.
Yeah, you have a funny quote by Lenin that I'd never heard of, but it really did make me laugh, even if I have problems with Lenin, which is like, at some point in the 1920s, he saw a slogan, one day, the workers and the peasants will rule eternally. And he says, this is the problem, because what we want is a society where there will be no workers and peasants, right? The whole purpose of our enterprise is that the worker liberates himself from being a worker, or herself, and so does the peasant, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like he says that if the worker and peasant rule forever, then we'll never have socialism, because socialism means the abolition of classes. And then this goes back to like what I said in the very beginning, which that, a Nietzschean socialism would be a fundamental negation of these fundamental aspects of bourgeois society, like wage labor and capital. And that would also include the overcoming of bourgeois forms of morality, which I think would be superseded, increasingly at least superseded in a socialist society.
I'd like to ask you about one of Nietzsche's particular escapes from the bourgeois day-to-day, one of the worst value tables, the last man's value table. But for him, art and aesthetics offers an escape into knowledge, or into a better form of knowledge. So where might aesthetics appear in Nietzschean socialism?
I actually have, towards the end of the book, I have a section on aesthetics. I've also written a short article on aesthetics in Marx and Nietzsche. And as you mentioned, art is a very important thing for Nietzsche. Marx is often seen as a kind of non-aesthetic thinker. But in the 1844 manuscripts, he actually connects human production to aesthetics, and says that there's actually an aesthetic aspect to human production. He actually says that humans produce also according to the laws of beauty. And I'll answer the question by going to a distinction that was made by Kant, which is the distinction between art and craft. And Kant says that art is done for its own sake. Craft is not pleasurable in itself, but is only done for an external reward, such as pay. So the way that we can understand Marx's idea of socialism in an aesthetic sense is precisely as the abolition of the distinction between art and craft, where art can be useful and useful production can be artistic. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's this, there is an idea of the aestheticization of human life in Marx, even if it's kind of, hidden.
No, I totally did not have a correct answer in mind. I was just wondering where you situated that, considering the fact that we're all content creators.
Yeah, so, actually, I just wanted to wrap up in our traditional way. Sorry to be boring, but you've done an awful lot over the last couple of years. And again, your new book is How to Philosophize with the Hammer and Sickle, Nietzsche and Marx for the 21st Century, with repeater books. You can find it at any number of fine retailers. Good holiday reading if you want to spend your time thinking about revolutionary agitation in between eggnog. But what's next?
It's an event, and it's an event linked in the description also.
It will shall be. What would you say is next for you, both in terms of your video essays, and do you think you have another book coming? And I guess I will make a pitch on behalf of Victor Brzone, another member of our Pill Pod, who isn't here, where you challenge John Rawls at various different points in the book.
Oh, no. Don't make him do
what do you
that.
describe it as? So my pitch for you on behalf of people like myself and Victor would be something on Rawls and why it is that you think this kind of left liberalism is bad, because I'd be interested in seeing that. But anyway. By any chance,
have you read Philosophy and Real Politics by Raymond Geuss?
I haven't, no.
I recommend that highly because I'm influenced a lot by his approach, where he critiques ethics first, political philosophy.
Right.
And he has a critique of Rawls there that I agree with, and I think you're influenced by Rawls, right?
Yeah, I mean, I call myself kind of a Rawlsian democratic socialist, but I completely agree that he has a impoverished theory of power, if there is a theory of power in his work at all. So it needs to be complicated a lot to kind of get it going politically. But I do like the kind of account of justice in the book.
It's pretty. I think you would find that book interesting, and I love it when Raymond Geuss says that the absence of power in John Rawls' philosophy is not a beauty mark, but a cancerous tumor.
All right. Well, Victor, when you listen to this episode, don't be too pissed off.
All right. So I'd like to end it with the most general question possible. You're a content creator in both book media, video essay media. I have some general questions, mostly because I'm struggling with them, and we've been kind of batting them back and forth. Are ideas political if they're just opinions that you have on the internet? Is the process of a book worth it? And how do you see the worth of making content when it just submits into this weird marketplace of egos and ideas and things like that? Do ideas matter? There's the sum up of the question.
Well, I guess my answer would be that not all ideas are created equal. And there's not really a way to know beforehand which ideas will become significant. because that's always throughout history has seemed kind of almost arbitrary which ideas win out. But as Marx said, philosophy itself becomes a material force when it grips the masses. So I think it's kind of a question of influence. If ideas become influential enough to make influence changes in the way people act and what they strive for, then yeah, absolutely, they do matter. But then that's an important part, is that you try to present your ideas in a way that they would actually have an influence on the world.
All right, this has been the Pill Pod. It's Matt and I interviewing Jonas Chika of CCK. There's no U. CCK Philosophy on YouTube. It looks like you're returning to YouTube. How's that been? Has it been better to have these like frequent releases where you get your little rush instead of spending a year and a half on a book?
Yeah, I really enjoy it. Like some people thought I would, quit my YouTube channel, but I don't have any plans to do that. My favorite part of just like, I guess what would be called content creation is being able to see that immediate feedback, and looking at the comments and looking at all the ways in which my content has produced various ideas in people, and seeing discussions kickstarted by my video. It's a great feeling, and it's nice to have that at a quicker rate.
And that certainly would never happen at an academic conference. It's the last place you'll get feedback. All right. Thanks so much, Jonas. Matt, I will talk to you guys soon.
Peace, dudes.
Thank you.